Hey everyone, it's Alexi here from Exile. So in this video, I'm going to take you through how to find comparables for your feature film, and I'm going to also show you what you can actually do with those comparables to hopefully give you a better idea of the type of film that you're making and the potential downside of that film. So let's dive in and get started. So a couple of rules to start off with before I get into the step-by-step process of just how you find comparables online and how you basically find and use that data. So the first thing to always keep in mind is that you're not looking for data to satisfy your own assumptions or projections. So it's important not to fall into the trap of just trying to find films that make your projections look good, or films that have enough of a return that are going to show that investors can recoup the amount of private investment that you're trying to raise, right? That's not what we're trying to do. What you should be doing is using these projections at a very early stage of the process, of like the financing process. Pretty much when you're deciding to work on a film and finance it, you should be basically going out there, finding comparables, looking at what the data says, using that to then inform how much private investment you're going to raise, because that's going to give you an idea about how much money the film can actually make, and it's going to give you the best chance of returning money to investors. So we want to do it that way rather than just trying to kind of pluck data that really just satisfies our own projections. So that's number one. Second one is we're not taking into account outliers. So part of this process isn't trying to find those films that just hit that blue sky potential and go absolutely gangbusters. They're not the ones we're looking for. We're trying to find data that is actually a more accurate reflection of the potential risk in the project. And so that's really the best use of comparables. You know, it's an analysis of the downside, not the potential upside. Now, that's not to say that when you're pitching investors, you don't want to show them what the potential upside can be. You absolutely want to do that. But we don't want to create a whole finance model around a best case scenario. We want to try and create a finance model around a worst case scenario and then leave heaps of potential for upside. That's basically how we want to do it. And of course, this is how I do it, right? Everyone has, can go about this their own way, but you're watching this video, so I'm hoping it's because you want to get the advice from me. So let's get into how you actually do it. So there's basically 6 factors that I always look at when I'm trying to find comparables for a new film. And I'll take you through those now. So those are the year of production, the genre of the film, the cast, the budget, and you can see these on my screen, the director's level of experience, and the country of production. They're really the 6 that I want to use as a way to determine whether a film is actually comparable. So within each of these, I'm going to take you through just quickly what they mean. I mean, a lot of them are self-explanatory, or you can see from this document. But what's important to know is, how much variance is there, right? How kind of flexible can you be with some of the criteria that I put in? So the first is year of production. I don't like to look at anything that's more than 5 years old, and ideally you're finding things within 3 years, because especially today, the industry is moving so quickly, distribution's changing so rapidly, that a film that was made 10 years ago is just going to, it was released in a completely different market. And honestly, even 5 years ago and even 3 years ago is a very different market, particularly with COVID. But we want to look, so really we want to try and find films that are as close to our year of production as possible, but no more than 5. And I would be strict with that. That's one of the factors that I wouldn't go past 5 years. The second is genre. So we want to make sure that we're comparing apples and apples, right? So we don't want to take a comedy and compare it against a horror. Seems obvious, but it's important to know. Now, where there's a bit of grey area is, well, what if it's a horror thriller or a horror comedy even, right? So that's where you need to have some flexibility in there. So for example, genre films you can group together in some way. So I'm going to take you through this in practice just to see how it works. But I want you to know that you can be a bit more flexible here, especially if you're looking at films that are like cross genres. Next one is cast. So look, I think a really good way to think about cast is, does the person down the street know the name of the actor? So if you're like walking down the street, you bump into someone, or you're at the supermarket and you turn to the person behind you and you say the name of that actor, you know, is that person going to recognize that name immediately? If they do, that's an A-list actor, right? That's someone that has huge international clout and has a lot of value and is recognizable in the marketplace. The next question, like if they don't know, you would say, oh, they were in X, right? And X would be a TV show or a film, you know, or they're that character in this show. And then you want to see if they then recognize that person, because that might mean that they recognize the face but not the name. And so that is what I would consider like the next level down of cast. And then the third level will be like they just don't know, you know, like that person is never going to guess or is never going to know who you're talking about. And so you want to think about it in those tiers, and again, make sure you're comparing people at a similar level. Next one is budget. So I would use ranges as follows: 0 to 2 million. Now I know that's a big range, but in my experience, you know, a micro budget film, $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 film, can often look the same as a $1 million film. And so I think in that like low budget range, I think it's fine to basically lump those together in one area, in one kind of range. You know, sometimes a film might be made for a really small cash budget, but it's just, you know, the filmmakers are really talented. They just didn't have the actual cash resources behind them, but they had enough other resources to make the film happen. And then I'd basically go like 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 70, and then 70 plus. The fifth one is director. So you want to be looking at a director's, like the level of experience, and to have them within really 2 to 3 films, ideally even 1 to 2, but 2 to 3 is fine. So, you know, if you're working on a debut feature film, you don't want to be looking at a film by a director who's working on their 5th or 6th film, because it's just, again, it's not comparing the same thing. That director has a completely different level of craft to a debut feature filmmaker, so you want to have that quite close. And then the last one is country. So I usually look at, you know, if a film is outside the US, then use comparable films that are outside the US. If it's within the US, use films that are produced in the US. And I think that's just because, given the US is such a big market, that films that are made and produced in the US have a better chance of succeeding in that marketplace generally, right? That's a bit of a generalization, but that's how I would do it. So I wouldn't be using an American film as a comparable for an Australian film. I'd be trying to find Australian films. The reason as well is because if you make, for example, an Australian film, it's almost a genre in itself, right? Like that, you know, when it's being sold in the marketplace, that it's an Australian film is part of that. Is part of that process. So they're the 6 factors that I use. So what I do from here is basically use our friend Google. And what I'm going to do is basically just run you through an example. It's a hypothetical. And I'm going to show you how I would basically find 3 comparables for this hypothetical film. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just check off each of the factors that I just took you through as I find my comparable film. So I'm going to put them in here, make sure that they check out here, and then just as a little bonus, I'm going to show you how to find the domestic and international box office and use that information. So, for the hypothetical, I'm going to be basically finding so it's going to be an Australian film in this case. It's going to be a genre film, so it's going to be an Australian horror film. It's going to be the director's second film, and it's going to have a budget of around 500,000 with no major cast. So the very first thing that I would do is actually I wouldn't try and find a film that necessarily fits within these factors straight away. I would just think of, okay, what's a well-known film that I know that is an Australian film, that's a horror film or like a genre film, as just a starting point. So the one that comes to mind for me is Snowtown. So I'm just going to look that up. Now, Snowtown was made in 2011, so that immediately for me isn't going to be incomparable, but it's going to be a starting point. Then what I'm going to do is basically scroll down in Google and look at this, which is people also search for. And then I'm going to click on that. And now this is going to bring up a bunch of movies that are similar to Snowtown. So now what I'm going to do is start to look through these and see if there are any comparable films. And so I can see this is an Australian film, this is an Australian film, this is an Australian film, that's an Australian film, Babadook, that's another one. Okay, so from here I'm going to use that as like a leaping off point. So I'm just going to take the first one, Nitram. I know that's Australian and it was made in 2021. Great, let's click on that. So first thing that pops up for me is it's a drama / psychological drama. It's not exactly the same genre. I might be flexible with it because it's a psychological drama. If it was just drama, I'd probably discount it immediately. But then I see that the director is Justin Kurzel, and I know that he's much more experienced and advanced in his career than just his second or third film. So I'm probably not going to include that as a comparable. So I'm going to move on. Wolf Creek, 2005, History of the Cali Gang. So let's take a look at that. Drama crime, so it's not an exact match, 2019, so it's quite new, so it fits, but again, Justin Kurzel. So obviously it's bringing up, because I had Snowtown in there, it's bringing up some of his films. So let's keep moving. Son of a Gun, that's too old. And then let's hit Babadook. So Babadook is the right genre, right director's level of experience, but it's a bit old, and actually it fits within the budget. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll down and hit see more here. And then what I'm going to do is have a quick look to see what else is coming up. Okay, so The Nightingale, that's 2018. Drama, psychological thriller, so that kind of fits the bill. That is her, I think it's her second film. And as far as I know, there were no major cast involved. So I'm probably going to use that as the first one. So I'm going to go back here and go. So yes, 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 yes. Now, it doesn't have the budget listed here. So what I would do actually, just to see if we can find a budget. So it's come up as 2 mil here. So I'm going to take that and use it. Now what I would do is use The Nightingale and then scroll down and go to see more. Alright, so now we've got a bunch more Australian films that have come up. And so what I'm going to do is basically just keep working through this until I find them. So I'll do one more just to give you an idea, and then that should give you enough. But one thing that is really important to keep in mind is that finding comparables, it takes time. Sometimes it can take hours to get right. So don't be discouraged if you're finding it difficult to find all the comparables, because it can take time. So let's go Berlin Syndrome, because that, out of these ones, it's 2017, so that's still 5 years. It's thriller. So it's Kate Shortland, and let's just check which film that was for her. Short. So 1, 2, 3. So third film. That's fine. So this looks like it could be good. Okay, so budget here is coming in at 5.5. So it might be too high to include. Yeah. 5.5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in here. And we're going to go yes. Now the cast was, I'm going to say no here. No, yes. So what I'm going to do with that, the reason I want to put that in, because it did hit a few of the marks, but not all of the marks. And so what I would do is, if I've basically taken this to the absolute, the furthest I can take it, I've done all the research I can, nothing else is coming up, then I might use that as a comparable, right? So the reason is the cast is they're not that A-list level, right? So it's not a huge jump, and the budget range is a decent size bigger, but knowing what that film is, it could be executed on a much smaller budget as well, just given the scope of it. So it's not like it has, it's quite a contained thriller, and it's not like you're comparing a horror film to like an action film. So it's still in the same realm. So that's basically how I do it. And I would just keep going through, basically hit Berlin Syndrome, and then I'd go see more again. And then basically just keep going through this time after time and trying to find those 3 films that are really comparable. Now, if you're outside the US, it is often a lot more difficult than if you are in the US, because so many more films are made in the US that you've just got way more options, and especially when it comes to films that actually have box office data. So that's the next thing that I want to take you through, which is basically finding box office information. So there's 2 sites that I use to do this, The Numbers and Box Office Mojo. They're both pretty accurate. You can use either. I usually would just use one if I can't find the other. So I would just type in Berlin Syndrome, The Numbers, and that is going to bring up the domestic and international box office here. And what's important to know is that domestic box office on The Numbers or Box Office Mojo always refers to the US, and international refers to everything outside the US. So you can see that you can click on international here, and you can basically see the box office in each of the main international territories. And if you scroll down, that breaks it down even further. So what I would do here is basically just take that, copy and paste, and then you've got your domestic and international. And then you can do the same for The Nightingale. Cool, so it's got domestic and international. And so now you can see how you can start building out the domestic and international revenue that was generated at the box office for each of these films. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Now, one, we're in the age of streaming. So if a film lands on Netflix or Apple or Amazon and gets a worldwide deal, we're not going to be able to find those numbers. So the first thing that I would do is basically search to see if the sale was disclosed, because sometimes if it was a high profile sale, if it was a sale at a big festival, sometimes those figures get published. And so you might be able to find an article where it actually references how much it was sold to one of those streaming platforms for. But if you can't find it, unfortunately that data is not out there. And so there's really not much that you can do in terms of trying to find those figures. It's just not available. Now, that's basically the process of how you find comparables and find the numbers.